The ballroom shimmered with a kind of hollow elegance, marble floors polished like mirrors, chandeliers dripping with light, and the clinking of crystal glasses barely masking the undercurrent of vanity and pretense. Everyone wore smiles that didn't reach their eyes. It was a gathering of the powerful and the performatively benevolent, the kind of event that billionaires attended not because they cared, but because it would look good on next month's cover of Philanthropy Monthly. Richard Grayson stood in the center of the crowd like a marble statue, immaculate, untouchable, cold. A tailored black suit hugged his tall frame, his salt and pepper hair slicked back with precision, his Rolex glinting beneath the sleeve. Everything about him screamed control, discipline, power. Beside him, in a wheelchair with one slightly trembling hand clutching the armrest, sat his 12-year-old son, Daniel. Daniel's face was gentle, too gentle for the room he was in. His eyes followed the motion of other children laughing and spinning to soft jazz, a longing buried beneath layers of shame. One leg twitched involuntarily under the blanket that covered his knees. His muscles were weak. His body failed him more often than not. But worst of all, he knew it made his father uncomfortable. Richard never looked at his son without a filter of disappointment. Even now, as the boy's lips moved slightly in rhythm with the music, the billionaire's eyes darted toward him, as if embarrassed by his presence. "I told you not to fidget," Richard whispered coldly, leaning down, his breath icy against Daniel's ear. I wasn't," Daniel stammered, startled. "People are watching." Richard cut him off. "You're not here to make a spectacle of yourself." Daniel lowered his head. His small fingers clutched the wheelchair tighter. In that moment, he looked more like an accessory than a child, a symbol Richard kept nearby to prove he could handle even this. A disabled son, a tragic narrative he could spin if necessary. From across the room, unnoticed, a young man in a server's uniform adjusted a tray in his hand and watched the scene unfold. His name was Jamal, tall, slim, with deep brown skin and a quiet steadiness in his posture. His eyes didn't blink away like the others when Richard barked at his son. No, Jamal saw. He had grown up seeing fathers like that, men in suits, men with tight mouths and tighter hearts, men who never wept, because they had already replaced their souls with stone. The music slowed. A few children stepped onto the polished floor, guided by volunteers, nurses, and event staff. It was meant to be a moment of joy, a symbolic dance. Most guests barely paid attention. They were too busy gossiping or watching themselves in the reflection of their own importance. But Daniel sat still, afraid. He wanted to move, to join them, to feel like a child, just for a minute. But he could already hear his father's voice if he tried. "You'll fall. You'll embarrass me." Richard was already turning away, speaking to some executive from Silicon Valley, laughing about stock prices. Daniel's presence had become white noise to him. Jamal put down the tray. He didn't know why he did it, only that he couldn't not do it. With calm, quiet steps, he crossed the room and crouched beside Daniel's chair. "Hey," he said gently, "you want to dance?" Daniel blinked. He didn't know how to answer. No one had ever asked him that. "Don't worry," Jamal smiled. "Just a step. I got you." And with that, something inside the boy stirred. Hope, terror, defiance, all mixed into one tiny, trembling hand that rose up from the armrest and reached for Jamal's. The contact of their hands was quiet, simple, barely noticeable among the din of laughter, clinking glasses, and artificial smiles. And yet, to Daniel, it felt like a thunderclap in the dead of night. No one had ever reached for him like that, not with care, not without pity. His fingers, bony and slow to move, curled uncertainly around Jamal's. The warmth of the waiter's skin contrasted with the cold pressure that always surrounded his father. It wasn't just a hand, it was an offering. A chance. Daniel swallowed. His legs didn't obey well. One knee shook. The other hung limp like a puppet without strings. But Jamal gave him no instructions, no pressure, just calmness, just presence. "I got you," he whispered again. And slowly, with the pace of a sunrise trying to push through thick clouds, Daniel stood. A gasp. Just one, soft, but sharp enough to slice through the music. Someone noticed, then another. Across the room, Richard turned. At first, his eyes didn't process what they were seeing. His son, on his feet, standing beside a stranger. Then came the second wave, rage. Not fury that Daniel was standing, but that he was standing without him, with a stranger, with a black stranger, a waiter. Richard's jaw locked. His temples pulsed. The Silicon Valley executive he'd been charming kept talking, unaware that the air around Richard had gone toxic. Across the dance floor, Jamal gave Daniel a soft nudge forward, just an inch. Enough for the boy's foot to slide forward with a trembling shuffle. That one step. It was nothing. And it was everything. A few people clapped, nervously, uncertainly. Some smiled, some filmed. Daniel's face flushed red, a storm of embarrassment and disbelief crashing through him. But Jamal didn't let go. "You're doing it," he said. Another step, this one weaker, but it came. And for the first time in months, Daniel laughed. It was a small laugh, fragile, like glass, but real, and that laugh carved its way like a fault line straight into Richard's spine. How dare he? How dare this stranger come near his son? How dare he expose his son's vulnerability like this, his shame, his blood, his secret weakness? He stormed across the room. Jamal didn't flinch. The claps died quickly, the smile stiffened. Everyone could feel the billionaire's fury before he even opened his mouth. "What do you think you're doing?" Richard's voice sliced the air. Jamal turned his head, his hand still holding Daniel's, helping him. "You touch my son again," Richard growled through clenched teeth, "and I'll make sure you're cleaning toilets for the rest of your life." There it was. Not even veiled. The power, the threat, the race. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. The room held its silence, suspended in shame, and no one moved. No one stepped forward. But Jamal, he didn't let go. With eyes steady as stone, he said only, "Then I'll clean them, but I won't let him sit there thinking he can't take a step." Silence. The silence of a room realizing it had just witnessed a crack in the ivory tower. Richard's lips twitched. His rage was quiet, but his face was red, his fists clenched, the muscles in his neck tight with years of suppressed disgust and fear and failure. "Put him back in the chair," he said, more to his son than the man. Daniel, shaking, looked at Jamal. I'm sorry. "Don't be," Jamal said quietly, crouching again and helping the boy sit, slowly, with dignity. As Richard grabbed the handles of the chair and wheeled his son away without a single backward glance, murmurs began to rise like smoke. The air had changed, and Jamal stood alone again. No applause, no medal, just silence. But he didn't need it. He'd given a boy something priceless, and taken the first chisel to a billionaire's frozen soul. Let's take a quick pause. Drop a comment and tell us, where are you watching from? Have you ever experienced something similar, where a stranger gave you more kindness than those closest to you? And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Now, let's continue. The limousine door slammed with a heavy thud, loud enough to make Daniel flinch in his seat. Silence filled the car like smoke, thick, suffocating, impossible to ignore. His father said nothing, not a word, not even a glance. Outside, the city passed in a blur of golden lights and quiet streets. Inside, the air was electric with unspoken rage. Daniel stared down at his trembling knees. He didn't know whether to cry, apologize, or disappear. He had never stood in front of a crowd before, never dared to. He hadn't thought it was wrong. He didn't even know why it felt so good. But Richard Grayson was simmering with humiliation. He didn't care about the dance. Not really. He didn't care that Daniel had stood. He cared how it happened. Not under a spotlight he had arranged. Not in a carefully curated Instagram post. Not after months of therapy paid with 7-figure donations. No, his disabled son had risen to his feet like a street act. With a waiter, in front of donors, in front of investors, in front of men who had once whispered such a shame about his boy. Richard's world was one of image, control, reputation. He had built empires from thin air, destroyed competitors with a phone call. He could buy nations, dictate markets. But tonight, he had been caught off guard by a moment he didn't control, a story that wasn't his to shape. And that was unbearable. The limousine turned into their estate. The gates parted like jaws, swallowing them whole. The mansion loomed ahead, its stone facade glowing under floodlights. It was massive, perfect, and cold, like Richard himself. Inside, staff stood in a line by the entrance as the car pulled in. No one smiled. No one moved. They knew the look on the master's face. As the driver opened the door, Richard exited first, tall, furious, silent. He didn't wait for Daniel. He didn't look back. A butler gently helped the boy out, avoiding eye contact. Daniel's legs were weak again, the strength from earlier already fading like a dream he wasn't sure had happened. He wheeled himself inside. The doors shut behind him with a finality that felt more like a verdict than a homecoming. Then came the storm. Richard's voice tore through the hallway like a whip. "What were you thinking?" Daniel froze. He was still halfway down the marble corridor, the wheels of his chair squeaking softly on the polished floor. I just wanted. You wanted? Richard spat, spinning around. You wanted to humiliate me in front of everyone? You wanted to make a fool of yourself? Of me? No, I just, he helped me stand. That's all. Richard's voice sharpened. That boy? That server? You let someone like him put his hands on you? You don't even know where he's from. Daniel's mouth opened, but nothing came out. The words jammed in his throat like stones. You think this is a fairy tale? Richard continued. You think people like him help people like us out of the goodness of their hearts? Wake up. You're lucky I don't fire him on the spot. A pause. Daniel swallowed, barely able to speak, but then he said it, quiet, trembling, but clear. Maybe he should be your son. The word slapped the air. Silence. For a full 5 seconds, Richard didn't move, didn't breathe. And then, a loud crash as his hand slammed the table beside him. A vase shattered into glittering fragments. The butler down the hall flinched. A maid ducked behind a corner. Daniel didn't cry. Not this time. He just stared at the broken porcelain, then up at the broken man. Richard's chest heaved. His lips curled. Go to your room, he said, his voice now cold, restrained, dangerous. And don't speak to me again until you learn what this family is. Daniel wheeled himself away slowly, the weight of the silence heavier than anything he'd ever felt. He reached his room, shut the door, and sat in the dark. Outside, the shattered vase remained. No one dared clean it up. And in a quiet apartment miles away, Jamal sat alone at his small kitchen table, counting tips that barely filled a shoebox, unaware that he had just become the match in a powder keg that would soon explode. The morning sun cut through the heavy curtains in Richard Grayson's mansion like cold knives. But inside, darkness still lingered. The shattered vase from the night before lay untouched on the marble floor, a silent testament to the storm that had torn through the family. The air was thick with tension, thick enough to choke on. Richard sat alone in his study, the walls lined with expensive art and accolades from a lifetime of ruthless ambition. But none of it mattered now. His thoughts churned like a storm: anger, humiliation, fear. The image of his son, Daniel, standing with that waiter, Jamal, the black waiter, haunted him, not because of the boy's courage, but because it tore at the foundation of everything Richard believed himself to be. On the other side of the city, Jamal woke up to a phone buzzing nonstop on his small kitchen counter, blinking away sleep. He saw the notifications, a flood of messages, social media tags, videos. Someone had filmed the dance moment. The video was going viral. The video showed Daniel, a fragile boy in a wheelchair, taking shaky steps on the dance floor, led by Jamal's steady hand. It showed the stunned faces of the guests, the fury in Richard Grayson's eyes, the threat whispered like a dagger. And underneath it all, the undeniable truth, kindness from an unexpected place. Jamal's phone rang. It was his manager at the restaurant, voice tense. Jamal, you're trending. People are calling the police. Some are threatening the restaurant. The billionaire's lawyers are involved. Be careful. Jamal swallowed hard. He hadn't meant to cause trouble. He just saw a kid who needed a hand. But trouble was exactly what followed. Back in the Grayson mansion, Richard's phone buzzed incessantly too. His assistant's voice came cold and clipped through the line. Sir, the video is everywhere. The press is calling. Shareholders want a statement. Investors are nervous. Richard's jaw clenched. I want it taken down. All of it. No excuses. The assistant hesitated. It's already spread too far. That was the moment the billionaire realized his perfect world was cracking. The news outlets spun the story with hunger. Billionaire's disabled son takes first step with help from black waiter. The headline screamed. Some called it heartwarming. Others smelled scandal. At Daniel's school, whispers started immediately. Kids pointed. Teachers exchanged nervous glances. Daniel felt eyes on him everywhere. He wanted to disappear. One boy shouted as he passed in the hallway, Hey, cripple, you got a new dance partner. Daniel's heart shattered with every cruel word. At the mansion, Richard summoned his top PR consultants. They crafted a polished, cold statement about charity, progress, and the importance of overcoming adversity, but never a word about Jamal. Meanwhile, Jamal faced something harsher. Anonymous threats appeared on his phone, racist slurs, warnings to stay away from rich people's business. The restaurant's owner told him to keep a low profile or risk losing his job. But Jamal stood firm. He knew what he had done was right. That night, Daniel sat by the window of his room, staring out at the city lights. His leg twitched. But this time it wasn't the tremor of weakness, it was the tremor of anger. Why does it have to be like this? He whispered to the empty room. Why can't kindness just be kindness? Behind the mansion's doors, Richard's empire trembled, not because of market crashes, but because of the one step his son took with a black waiter. And somewhere in the distance, a storm was gathering, one that would bring everything crashing down. The city was buzzing, but for Daniel, the noise was deafening silence. Every glance from a stranger felt like a judgment, every whisper a condemnation. At school, the halls became battlegrounds. What had started as curious stares soon spiraled into cruel taunts. "Look at the rich kid trying to be normal," sneered a boy named Carter, his voice loud enough for others to hear. "Bet his daddy bought that dance, too." Daniel tried to ignore it, focusing on the books and the teachers who pretended not to see. But the sting of isolation was sharper than any blade. His classmates didn't understand the pain beneath the smile he forced. They only saw his wheelchair, his hesitation, his broken body. At home, the atmosphere was colder than winter's bite. Richard Grayson moved through the mansion like a ghost haunted by failure. He paced his office, staring at the video on his phone as if it was a wound that wouldn't heal. "Get rid of the waiter," Richard demanded at a family meeting, his voice low but dangerous. "He's poison. If he's not gone, our entire world will crumble." Daniel's mother, a woman whose beauty masked a brittle heart, shook her head. "You're being cruel, Richard. The boy only wanted to help." "Help?" Richard spat. "He's a servant, nothing more. How dare he step into our lives?" The word echoed like a curse. Meanwhile, Jamal faced his own war. The restaurant where he worked became a battleground of whispered threats and cold stares. Customers who once smiled now averted their eyes. One night, a brick crashed through the front window with a note attached, racist slurs scrawled across the paper, a warning to stay away. Jamal's hands trembled as he picked up the shards of glass. Fear and anger warred inside him, but he refused to let hatred win. Word of the threats reached Daniel. One night, Jamal called him. "Stay strong, Daniel," Jamal said quietly. "Sometimes, the fight is bigger than us, but you're not alone." Daniel stared at the phone long after the call ended. The courage he had found in Jamal's voice was a fragile flame. Could it be enough? The next morning, Daniel's wheelchair rolled into the school gym. A group of students gathered, their faces hard with disdain. "Hey, cripple," Carter called out again. "You got a new friend? The waiter gonna teach you more steps?" Daniel's heart thundered. The laughter that followed was cruel and sharp. But this time, Daniel didn't look away. With trembling hands, he reached into his backpack and pulled out a crumpled flyer, an announcement for a local charity dance event, featuring Jamal as a volunteer teacher. "I'm dancing with him," Daniel said quietly, voice steady despite the trembling inside. "Not because of money or pity, because he's the only one who showed me I can." Silence fell. Some students shifted uncomfortably, others sneered, but Daniel's words hung in the air, raw and true. Across town, Richard watched a news report about the growing support for Jamal and Daniel's story, his face twisted in rage and fear. His empire was no longer safe. And in the shadows, the forces of hate prepared to strike harder. The city was no longer just a backdrop, it had become a battleground. The story of Daniel and Jamal had exploded across social media, news outlets, and whispered conversations in every corner. What was meant to be a simple moment of kindness had ignited a firestorm, one that threatened to burn down carefully constructed walls of wealth, power, and prejudice. Inside the Grayson estate, the air was suffocating. Richard Grayson, once a titan of industry and society, was unraveling before the eyes of his closest confidants. His sharp suits no longer seemed to armor him. His voice cracked in meetings. His eyes darted with paranoia. "Are you sure this can be controlled?" his PR chief pressed. Richard slammed his fist on the mahogany desk, making the crystal glasses jump. "Control? Control is an illusion. This isn't just a story, this is an attack. On me, on my family, on everything I built." His daughter, Elise, watched from the doorway, her expression unreadable. She had grown tired of her father's iron fist, his endless crusade to preserve a hollow legacy. Meanwhile, Daniel was drowning in a sea of contradictions. At school, the taunts grew louder, but so did unexpected whispers of support. A handful of classmates began to rally quietly around him, inspired by his courage and Jamal's quiet strength. But Daniel's home was a prison. Each day, Richard's icy disapproval froze any attempt at hope. Therapy sessions were cut short. Visits from friends were discouraged. The mansion's grand halls echoed with silence and the weight of unmet expectations. One evening, Daniel found a letter slipped under his bedroom door. It was unsigned. "You're a disgrace. Your father's reputation is crumbling because of you. Stop this madness before it destroys us all." His hands shook as he read the words, the poison sinking deep. Across town, Jamal's life was spiraling into danger. The threats intensified. His shift at the restaurant ended with broken glass and a blackened tire on his car. Police reports were filed, but no arrests made. The community was divided. Some hailed Jamal as a hero. Others whispered venom behind closed doors. At night, Jamal sat alone in his small apartment, staring at the same video looped on his phone, the moment he helped Daniel take a step. The memory was bittersweet now. He knew the storm was coming. One day, Jamal received an unexpected visitor, a young woman with a camera, an activist from a local nonprofit. "We want to tell your story," she said firmly. "Not just the dance, but everything. The threats, the hate, the courage." Jamal hesitated. The price was high. Back in the Grayson mansion, Richard's empire began to crack publicly. Investors demanded answers. The board held emergency meetings. The facade of perfection was crumbling, revealing raw fear beneath. That night, Daniel stood at the window, watching the city lights flicker like distant fires. His leg ached, but this time the pain was nothing compared to the fire burning in his chest. He whispered to the darkness, "This isn't over, not by a long shot." And far away, in the shadows of the city, the forces of hate prepared their next move, one that would shake the lives of Daniel, Jamal, and the Grayson family forever. The city was no longer just watching, it was judging. Every screen, every conversation was consumed by the unfolding saga between Daniel, Jamal, and the Grayson family. What started as a simple act of kindness had exploded into a maelstrom of anger, fear, and raw injustice. Daniel's world spiraled into chaos. At school, whispers had turned to outright hostility. The hallways were battlegrounds where cruel words struck like knives. A group of students led by Carter had escalated from taunts to threats. One afternoon, Daniel found his wheelchair vandalized, the tires slashed and the seat ripped. His mother's tears filled the quiet mansion, but Richard's fury grew colder and more calculating. "I will end this," Richard vowed one evening, voice low but deadly. "If the law won't stop him, I will." Meanwhile, Jamal was no longer safe. Late one night, his apartment door was kicked in. He barely escaped harm, but his sense of security shattered forever. The police offered little protection. Their sympathies lay elsewhere. Determined to fight back, Jamal reached out to community leaders and activists. A movement began to form, voices rising to challenge the prejudice and violence. But with the growing support came an even darker backlash. One night, Daniel received a call. The voice on the other end was cold and threatening. "Tell your daddy to back off, or you'll regret ever dancing." Fear tightened its grip around Daniel's heart. Yet in that same moment, something inside him snapped. He refused to be a victim. In the Grayson mansion, Richard's empire teetered on the brink of collapse. The board threatened to remove him. Investors pulled out. His carefully constructed world was crumbling. But Richard was not ready to surrender. His next move was ruthless, a smear campaign targeting Jamal's past, digging up every detail to discredit him. Yet Jamal remained steadfast. Supported by the community and fueled by the injustice, he prepared to face the storm head-on. As tensions exploded publicly, Daniel's small circle of friends grew bolder. They organized rallies, spoke to reporters, and refused to let his story be silenced. In the shadows, the true cost of courage became clear: losses, betrayals, and sacrifices that would scar everyone involved. The dance that had started as a step toward hope had become a battlefield for justice, identity, and survival. And the reckoning was only just beginning. The city was aflame, not just with protests and headlines, but with a rage that simmered beneath every interaction. The story of Daniel and Jamal had ignited something fierce, drawing allies and enemies alike into a storm neither could have foreseen. Daniel woke that morning to a world that no longer felt safe. His wheelchair had been vandalized again overnight. This time, the words "go back" were scratched into the paint. The note was clear, the hatred was personal, and it was escalating. At school, the harassment intensified. Teachers whispered behind closed doors, unsure how to protect a boy caught in the crossfire. The principal called a tense meeting with Daniel's parents, offering sympathy but little concrete help. Richard Grayson, meanwhile, played a cold game behind the scenes. His lawyers pushed a campaign painting Jamal as a troublemaker with a questionable past, digging into every detail to destroy his credibility. News outlets picked up the smear with eager hunger, feeding the growing divide. Jamal's phone buzzed nonstop with hateful messages and threats. One night, A brick shattered the restaurant's front window, the shards raining like broken promises on the floor. Staff grew nervous, customers dwindled, but Jamal refused to back down. At home, Daniel's mother wept silently in the kitchen, clutching a photo of her son. "This isn't just about a dance step anymore," she whispered. "It's a war." One evening, as Daniel practiced moving his wheelchair alone in the empty park, a group of teenagers approached. Their faces were masked by shadow, but their intentions were clear. "Thought you could make a fool of us?" one spat. Daniel's heart pounded. He braced himself, hands gripping the wheels tightly. But before the attack could begin, a voice rang out sharply. "Enough!" It was Jamal, rushing in with a few local friends who had heard about the threat. The confrontation was brief but brutal. The teens scattered, leaving behind only a bitter taste of fear and defiance. The city's tension reached a breaking point. News cameras swarmed the site, capturing Jamal's protective stance and Daniel's determined glare. The footage spread like wildfire, stirring debate and outrage. Richard's empire shook beneath the weight of public scrutiny. Board members demanded action. Investors pulled funds. He was losing control faster than he could imagine. But Daniel, despite the pain, the hatred, the fear, found a new strength rising within him. The fire that had threatened to consume his spirit was now fueling his will to fight. As flames of fury lit the night sky in protests and backlash, the war for dignity, justice, and hope had only just begun. The aftermath of the confrontation in the park left an echo that rippled far beyond that quiet neighborhood. News outlets had caught every moment: Jamal's protective courage, Daniel's unyielding spirit, and the city was divided like never before. Daniel woke each day to a world that felt increasingly hostile. At school, the faces around him hardened. Some wore contempt, others carried pity like a shield, but few showed genuine understanding. Teachers glanced away, unwilling or unable to intervene against the rising tide of cruelty. One afternoon, Daniel found himself alone in the locker room, the laughter and jeers still ringing in his ears. His wheelchair was scratched again, the words "not welcome" etched cruelly into the metal frame. Tears burned behind his eyes, but he clenched his fists, forcing himself to stand tall. This was no longer just about his body or his disability, it was about his dignity, his right to live without fear. Meanwhile, Jamal's life spiraled deeper into chaos. The threats escalated from words to violence. His car was vandalized, tires slashed and windows shattered. The police offered little protection. Some officers barely concealed their disdain. Determined not to be broken, Jamal leaned harder into activism. He organized community meetings, rallied local leaders, and became a symbol of resilience. But the cost was high, his relationships strained, his sleep haunted by nightmares of retaliation. At the Grayson mansion, Richard's world was crumbling. Investors withdrew, board members whispered about his removal, and the media painted him as a villain clinging to old prejudices. But even his fiercest resistance couldn't hide the cracks forming beneath his armor. Back in the city, the movement supporting Daniel and Jamal grew stronger, louder. Rallies erupted, voices united in calls for justice and change. The flames of rage and hope intertwined, illuminating the path ahead. Yet amidst the chaos, Daniel and Jamal knew the fight was far from over. Every step forward was met with resistance, every victory shadowed by loss. As night fell over the city, Daniel stared out at the skyline, the weight of it all pressing down on him. But deep inside, a quiet resolve whispered, no matter the cost, he would keep fighting, for himself, for Jamal, for every voice silenced by hate. The tension in the city had reached a fever pitch. Months of anger, fear, and defiance had worn on everyone involved, pushing them to their limits. But amid the chaos, something remarkable began to take shape, a fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, change was possible. Daniel sat in his wheelchair beneath the soft glow of a street lamp, his eyes fixed on the faces gathered around him. Tonight was not just another protest, it was a gathering of voices united by pain and determination. Jamal stood by his side, hands steady but heart-pounding, as they prepared to speak to the crowd that had grown from a handful of friends to thousands. The air was thick with anticipation. People from every walk of life, black, white, disabled, able-bodied, stood shoulder to shoulder. They were tired of hatred, of silence, of injustice. They had come to demand something better. When Daniel spoke, his voice was clear despite the weight of his journey. "This is more than just my fight," he said. "It's all of ours. For every person who's been told they don't belong, who's been pushed aside or forgotten, we take this step together. Not just a dance step, but a step toward dignity, respect, and change." The crowd erupted in cheers. Jamal followed, sharing his own story of struggle and hope, reminding everyone that courage wasn't the absence of fear but the choice to face it. Meanwhile, far from the streets, Richard Grayson sat alone in his study, the walls closing in around him. The empire he had built on power and prejudice was crumbling, his own daughter's words echoing in his mind. For the first time, he confronted the cost of his actions, not just the loss of money or status, but the damage to his family and his own humanity. Elisa's letter lay on the desk, a plea for change that cut deeper than any public scandal. He realized that the fight to preserve his world had blinded him to the world changing outside his windows. In the days that followed, a series of meetings, apologies, and reconciliations unfolded. Daniel's school implemented new policies to protect students like him. The community began addressing the deep wounds of racism and ableism, confronting uncomfortable truths. Jamal's restaurant reopened with the support of the city, a symbol of resilience and unity. The dance that had started it all, the moment Jamal let Daniel lead a step, became a symbol, a reminder that even the smallest acts of kindness could ignite a revolution. And that change begins when we dare to step forward together. As Daniel and Jamal stood side by side on a stage, faces illuminated by the hopeful glow of countless candles, the future seemed uncertain but promising. They had faced hatred, pain, and loss, but they had also found strength, friendship, and hope. And in that moment, the city breathed a little easier, knowing that a step toward tomorrow had been taken, and that it was only the beginning.